a crisis featuring 15% of world trade, $1 trillion per year, 10% of all seaborne oil, and $9.4 billion in annual tolls. That and more are the stakes currently in play in the Red Sea, as the eyes of the world converge on yet another crisis. This time, it is at the nexus of a long-running civil war in Yemen and the war in Gaza, which now threatens ships in the region, which in turn threatens the entire global economy. Against that backdrop, attention has turned to the United States and an ambitious plan to safeguard passage through the region. But will it work? To start working towards some answers to that question, today, we are going to discuss the background of the broader conflict in the region, the more recent pivot to a shipping crisis, just how much damage this might cause, what the United States is trying to do to stop it, whether that plan will work or not, and what might happen if those efforts fail and the sea functionally disappears for traders at large. Oh, and we will also have a short story on how Somali pirates, in a very weird way, somehow saved Ukraine's flagship from falling into the hands of Russia once upon a time. But we start with a brief background on the underlying conflict. I'm going to do my best to keep this short, limited to the key parts that connect to the broader geopolitical situation. Rewind to September 2014. After 10 years of insurgency in northwest Yemen, an entity known as the Houthi movement made its big, move, and seized Yemen's capital within a few days. Following months of work toward a political solution inside of Yemen, the situation blew up. The Houthis occupied the presidential compound. However, the president living in the compound vanished, and subsequently reappeared in his southern hometown. And now, for about a decade and counting, the parties in Yemen have waged a civil war, though the long timeline is not particularly surprising given that civil wars tend to last much longer than interstate wars do. The original government remains the one with widespread international recognition, and, perhaps equally as important, long-running recognition from Washington. It also has the backing of a large intervention led by Saudi Arabia, and also featuring at various times Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Egypt, Jordan, Sudan, Qatar, Morocco, and Senegal, with secondary support from Western powers. For completeness, this coalition has frayed and fragmented over time, but that is tangential to today's story. Meanwhile, by all intelligence accounts, the Houthis' main backer is Iran, though Iran officially denies that role. The result is a status quo Houthi territorial control that looks roughly like this. Still the vast minority of the country, though again the Houthis' political arm controls the capital. One key thing that they do not control, however, is the southern tip of the country. Make a mental note of that for later. Despite all that regional drama, the Houthis managed to avoid major headlines until 2023. That takes us to the crisis at hand. The Houthis began attacking cargo ships off the coast of Yemen in November of that year. I use began loosely here because low-level threats in the region had been there for a long time, but this is when things started to spiral out of control. The ship Galaxy Leader was boarded via helicopter and taken hostage to a Houthi-friendly port on November 19th. Then there was a drone strike on November 24th, 3 missile strikes on December 3rd, another on December 12th, a failed hijacking the next day, a missile attack the day after, another missile attack, and a separate drone strike the day following, 2 missile attacks on December 18th, 2 drone attacks on December 23rd, a missile attack after a brief Christmas recess, and a missile attack on December 30th that culminated in a failed hijacking on December 31st. Whew. Bear with me for a second while I catch my breath. Okay. There was also a wave attack of drones against the USS Carney on December 16th, which I've excluded from that list because it is not a cargo ship. And fair warning, there have probably been more attacks since I produced this, but such is the nature of commentary on current events. In all, though, that is at least 16 distinct cargo vessels targeted thus far. Oh, and in the middle of everything, Somali pirates tried to hijack another ship. Because why the heck not? The crazy thing about all of this is that its impetus has no direct connection to the Yemen Civil War. Rather, this is about the Hamas conflict that began on October 7th, but has since been defined by Israel's operations in Gaza. We have discussed before how militant groups use violence as a form of advertisement. It is their way of saying, hey, our group is the best. Come join our cause. Oh, and while you're at it, give us your charitable contributions. Those things are all scarce. We want to get them, and we do not want to see them go to our peer competitors. Is it perverse? Yes. But it is also a time-tested strategy. October 7th gave the Houthis 2 reasons to get the commercials going against commercial container ships. First, anti-Israel, and subsequently anti-West sentiments have exploded in the wake of Israel's Gaza operations. The larger the jackpot, the more incentive there is to play the game. The second piece of the puzzle is that Hamas was by far the biggest advertiser of the year up until that point. Anyone sitting on the sidelines who did not act, Houthis included, took the risk of being relegated to a clear second tier. If that logic is still unclear, here is a helpful analogy. It is like when a business co-ops a social movement. You might get the feeling that the owner does indeed care about it, but your cynical inner voice often suspects that what they are really doing is making the movement a centerpiece of a de facto advertising campaign to convince more customers to buy from the business. It is the same thing here, but with more explosions, and the Palestinian cause as the social movement. The Houthis previously tried firing ballistic missiles into Israel, but that failed to generate the same level of buzz. To wit, I struggled to find this headline under a mountain of other headlines about Red Sea shipping. This is despite the fact that one Israeli interceptor struck a Houthi missile above the Earth's atmosphere, marking history's first act of space warfare. Feels like a bit of a technicality here because it was one Earth weapon hitting another Earth weapon that was incidentally in space. It is not exactly how they were drawing it up decades ago. Sorry, Reagan. In any case, this is how we ended up at this point. Okay, we're all done with the Houthi side of things. Now let's get to the meat of the story, the damage that this is causing. The good news is that in terms of direct costs, the damage remains minimal. Now, the status of the Galaxy leader lingers in doubt until the hostage situation ends. But that aside, the only fatalities thus far have been to the Houthis, and all of those other vessels from earlier have sustained little to no damage. However, the full economic impact has been brutal, because the real story here is the spillover effects to international trade. The Houthis originally threatened to only target Israeli-affiliated ships. In practice, though, that is complicated. You could have an Israeli crew, you could have Israeli cargo, or you could have Israeli ownership. Those latter 2 possibilities are opaque. A single Israeli entrepreneur may own a small percentage of the company, or a handful of containers could house Israeli products. It is possible that a ship's crew might not even know whether they meet the Houthis' criteria or not. Never mind that we are talking about a rebel group, a political class not exactly known for reliable intelligence. Even if a ship is 100% Israel-free, and you believe that the Houthis intend to stay within those defined limits that seem to receive frequent additions to, you probably still would not feel all that comfortable in the area. This has led to a giant logistical headache. Let's zoom out to the broader region. Yemen sits at the bottom of the Red Sea and along the Gulf of Aden, with a strait between them that narrows down to just 26 kilometers, or 16 of my preferred freedom units. Although you will recall that the Houthis do not control down to the chokepoint, advances in missile and drone technology mean that they can cover the area well enough to threaten anyone who comes through. But the real hang-up is what is to the north, the Suez Canal, the world's favorite real-life warp zone. And while all of the pipes ultimately go to the Mediterranean, the ability to cut through Africa rather than go around it is how we get to those ridiculous economic numbers from the beginning of today. And let us not ignore Egypt's predicament here. Already annoyed by a pending refugee crisis on its border with Gaza, no canal traffic means no tolls to collect. And this is no minor expressway. Crossing with a large ship might run in the mid-six figures. Note to millennials, avocado toast is not the reason that you cannot buy a house. Your real problem is that you cannot pretend to be a Suez toll collector for just 5 minutes. Alternatively, if you can pretend to be a collector for the entirety of the previous fiscal year, you can rake in $9.4 billion. Going back to the rest of the world, and worse for everyone, that is only the tip of the iceberg. If you remember the silliness that happened when the Ever Given blocked the entire canal in 2021, we are basically looking at that. Except it is a political problem now, not one for engineers, so there is no fixed endpoint for the issue. I could also draw a comparison to the 1956 Suez Crisis, and while I know my channel demographics skew old, they are not that old, so I think we can leave it at that. In any case, we are subject to all of the classic issues here. Remember the unholy trinity of pandemic inflation? You had money printer go burr, demand shocks, and supply chain disruptions. Well, the Houthis have decided to reveal what is behind door number 3. It is hard to measure exactly how many ships are diverting right now, but it started at something like a third, and has gotten worse over time. According to the IMF's Port Watch website, and I must say, for an organization known for being bland, Port Watch is the coolest that the IMF has ever sounded. Passage at the Bab el-Mandeb Strait dropped from 79 ships per day from the first week of 2023 to only 43 ships per day from the first week of 2024. This will start to rack up the delays, as going around the southern coast of Africa adds between 1 week and almost 1 month to the journey, depending on the ship's speed and destination. So if a single part of your supply chain is sitting on one of those ships, you are going to have to shutter your whole factory until the silly thing arrives. And that assumes that such a trip is feasible. The long way requires extra fuel, and ports around Africa simply are not equipped to handle the additional demand. To wit, daily transit calls at Africa's Cape of Good Hope went from 43 per day at the beginning of 2023 to 70 per day at the beginning of 2024. And that is all because they did not want to be up here. Further, no one is building the appropriate infrastructure on Africa's coastlines to resolve the problem, because the common belief is that the Houthi situation is transitory. Oops, did I just say the forbidden economics T word? Heaven forbid. The consequence is that ships are paying more, and the existing port owners are enjoying some sweet, sweet windfall profits. You have probably seen an endless stream of news reports of how these shipping costs from the shippers are going to be passed on to the manufacturers, who will in turn pass them along to end customers. But the mechanism by which that happens is a little more nuanced than what you see in the news articles. For simplicity, imagine that all cargo ships in the world solely traverse the Red Sea, and now suddenly they have to go around Africa instead. And let's just standardize the longer route as doubling total shipping times. This is the equivalent of eliminating half of the world's fleet overnight. Suddenly, the manufacturers have to compete for the more scarce time slots on ships. So the ones who really want to keep their warehouse shelves empty start bidding up the prices. Then, because there are fewer products available at the end market, the consumers who really do not want to go home with an empty cart tolerate paying the higher prices. Then you have a group of frustrated consumers who do not buy anything, and a group of equally frustrated manufacturers whose goods never left the port to begin with. Now, in practice, things are not quite this bad. Other cargo ships can divert from their regular routes to cover some of the gaps. But then that means there are other manufacturers across the world who are left out in the cold. And no, more ships will not suddenly be built to address the problem. Again, because of that dreaded T word. Gotta blow up that one too. What that means is that if you are a consumer who somehow never touches a product that came through the Red Sea, even secondhand as an intermediate good, maybe you think the Panama Canal is the only canal that you find acceptable, you do you, you are still going to be hit with higher prices. But the timing on this is not exactly great either. Those Panama Canal stands out there know that the world's second most important warp zone is also having problems right now. This is because of lack of rainfall of all things. The canal needs rainwater to properly run its lock system. They do not have enough of that right now. More ships going around Tierra del Fuego means more days at sea eaten up, which also means fewer trips for sail, just as it is for a trip around Africa. Meanwhile, the problem is especially acute for oil tankers. Ever since the invasion of Ukraine began, yes, I know, somehow this always connects back to Russia, tanker capacity has come at a premium. That is because the West's economic sanctions against the Kremlin are having weird distortionary effects, like Saudi Arabia importing foreign oil just to export more of its domestic supply. The extra in and out needs a fleet of tankers on both ends, and the market is just not set up for that. Moreover, as if to mock us, a good chunk of that extra tanker usage was going through the Red Sea, with oil traffic up about 140%. Now, with all of that extra hassle, you might think that an enterprising shipping company would want to roll the dice and try to run the gauntlet. However, the financial barrier there is substantial. Insurance companies offer war and piracy coverage for just such an occasion. Under normal circumstances, insurance for those things for the route would cost about 0.02% of your cargo's value. Now it stands at 0.7%. So if you had a ship with $100 million in cargo, and that is commonplace, you went from paying $20,000 to $700,000. It went from costing 1,600 plates of fancy sit-down restaurant avocado toast to one large suburban home. Given what is at stake, you would expect a response to the problem. And that is how we ended up with Operation Prosperity Guardian. As alluded to earlier, the Houthi threat is nothing new to the region. Well before the current crisis, back in April 2022, the United States led in creating Combined Task Force 153 to enhance security in the area. But with the Houthis making a play, the United States has pushed to expand operations in the region. That meant deploying a fleet of vessels, headlined by the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower, this nice carrier here, that we previously covered as a proactive U.S. deployment to the region following October 7th. Beyond the U.S. effort, the United Kingdom, Denmark, and Greece are also deploying one ship each. If those latter two are confusing, Maersk, the company that keeps making headlines for pulling its ships from the Red Sea, is Danish. Meanwhile, Greece is big in international shipping more generally, and the Red Sea matters for its geography. In addition to those countries, Canada, the Netherlands, and Australia are supplying support staff. And there are rumors of anonymous partners, the puzzling logic behind which we will get to later. There is precedent for something like this to work. Flashback to 2009, when Somali pirates were initially telling everyone that they were the captains of the Horn of Africa. Operation Ocean Shield was another US-led coalition that set sail to ensure safe passage through the region. Although its patch left a lot to be desired, the operation worked. It is the reason that public awareness of the whole situation is a meme about being the captain, and not daily headlines anymore. At first pass, these operations appear doomed for failure, because they have all of the makings of a collective action problem. That is, if someone pays to get something, they only internalize a small portion of the benefit accrued to everyone globally. Thus, policymakers may calculate that the individual country's cost may exceed the country's benefit. If so, that country does not contribute to the public good and hopes to free ride off the labors of others. But what if everyone felt that way? Well, it is bad news. Then the public good, safe seas in this case, never gets provided. This occurs despite how everyone would be made better off if they each contributed a little bit to the operation. Some simple hypothetical numbers help illustrate the problem. Suppose that there is $100 million in total profits to be had in the Red Sea, divided evenly among 100 countries. If every $1 in military expenditures protects a generic $2 of the profits, then clearly this is a wise big-picture investment. The problem is that if it is indeed protecting a generic $2 of profit, that means that you only internalize 2 cents of the benefits of every protection dollar. Paying $1 to return 2 pennies is a bad investment for you individually, even if the profits to the group are great. Thus, you refuse to participate. For you game theorists out there, it is basically a large-scale prisoner's dilemma. If this type of problem sounds familiar, that is because it is a key reason why the West did not provide sufficient aid for Ukraine's 2023 offensive to succeed. However, there are a couple of differences between the hypothetical example and reality that saves these situations from being Ukraine 2.0. One key difference in the Red Sea is that the United States is a disproportionate beneficiary of global trade. As a result of that, a core U.S. foreign policy tenet since, well, the beginning, and certainly since Woodrow Wilson and the end of World War I, and definitely since the post-World War II rules-based liberal order came into being, is freedom of navigation. In other words, the benefit does exceed the cost for Washington, and thus the collective action concern does not apply to it. Ah, the joys of hegemony. Then, given the United States' contribution, other states want to latch on with comparatively small commitments so that they can have a seat at the table, even if by doing so they are implicitly acknowledging the United States as the head of that table. Actually, Ukraine, during the bygone era when it still had a functioning navy, sent its flagship to participate in Operation Ocean Shield against those Somali pirates. Strangely enough, this might have saved the ship from falling under Russian control in 2014. See? Still present with Petro Poroshenko as president. It set sail from Crimea under the prior administration in October 2013 to help out along the Horn of Africa. Thus, when Viktor Yanukovych fled Kyiv and the Battle of Crimea began, the ship was nowhere near the hot zone and was therefore not a part of the series of defections that allowed Russia to annex the peninsula, even if Ukraine would eventually have to scuttle it at the start of the invasion. In any case, the United States is happy for this kind of help, because those small contributions combine to form a relatively large stake, which then helps defray Washington's costs. The key question, though, is whether it will work, and that is far from certain. Continuing with the parallel to Operation Ocean Shield, there is a major difference between the incentive structures of piracy and political violence. Pirates just want to plunder booty, and they will chase whatever booty is easiest to plunder. Park the USS Eisenhower in front of your cargo ship, and any pirate with even the slightest sense of self-preservation will pass on it. This makes it easier more generally to resolve the problem with collective action. Going back to the example, the $1 you invest does not protect a generic $2. It disproportionately protects your own ships. But that means that providing safety to your country's vessels imposes what we call a negative externality on all other ships in the region. That is, the pirate that would have otherwise attacked the American vessel now finds the next unguarded target. In turn, the more countries that contribute to the shield, the more incentive you have to contribute to the cause as well, lest your vessels be the only remaining ones that are unprotected. Of course, there is still some underlying incentive to free ride. If the patrols will destroy all of the pirates without you anyway, then there is no need to pay the price. The point here is that some of that political free-riding temptation is offset. How that extends to politically motivated violence is unclear, though. Suppose that this is your ship. If it is being targeted not because of what is on it, but rather because it is your ship, then it seems like you need your military to protect it. But then that just adds another ship for the political violence entrepreneurs to target. Furthermore, if bystanders join the coalition, then they suddenly make themselves part of the target group. This may be driving those anonymous participants to remain anonymous. Another barrier is the lack of United Nations mandate. This would otherwise grease the wheels to get others to contribute. Russia seems uninterested in supporting a resolution, and during debates within the Security Council, accused the United States of holding up an international consensus on Israel's Gaza operations. Russia, of course, has veto power, so that kills the chances. It is worth reiterating that Russia needs passage through the Red Sea for its oil operations, so we will see how this plays out over time. Remember that the Houthis could be told by countries friendly to Russia to lay off those vessels. Then there is the practical problem with playing defense. The United States is spending millions combating each attack. The Houthis are spending thousands to commit each of those attacks. Although they do not control the narrowest part of the choke point, the fact that so much of the coastline is now under Houthi control means that attacks have occurred all the way up to here. Zooming in some ways, it would be better if the Houthis controlled just the choke point and nothing else. Then the operation could play a zone defense and require relatively few ships to cover the entire danger zone. The coalition, as the Department of Defense is framing it, is indeed using a zone defense right now. For the purposes of our international audience, good on them to use basketball as the metaphor and not gridiron football. However, the reason for the zone defense is that the coalition lacks sufficient ships to do one-on-one coverage, and not because the ships can actually dominate the entire waterway. For this to be sustainable, the operation must deter long-term Houthi interference, perhaps by scaring the Houthis about what might happen next if they do not quit. This was basically the sentiment of the coalition's January 3rd joint statement: stop it, or else. And that takes us to what the or else part might mean. It is a safe bet that the United States will not be partaking in a large ground invasion anytime soon. Washington learned its lesson on wars in the Middle East a long time ago, and Biden himself has some bad memories of withdrawing from Afghanistan. Then again, the threat might linger for a year or more. It's anyone's guess what is going to happen in November. Instead, something more akin to the intervention in Libya is more likely. The United States has a potential partner on the ground in the internationally recognized government of Yemen. That leaves the United States to handle the air game, just like Libya. However, there are three major problems here without obvious solutions. First up is that it will be hard to round up the allies to go on the offense. The issue is that doing so would put a target on their backs even larger than the Sea Shield does. Second is that the Saudi-led coalition has already engaged in an air campaign and thoroughly hit all of the prime targets. It is the classic counter-value deterrence dilemma. Once everything worth anything has already been destroyed, you cannot use the threat to destroy it as further leverage. Third is that the source of the Houthi armaments is probably not in Yemen. Remember that the Yemen Civil War is a proxy battle, with the internationally recognized government being backed by Saudi Arabia, and the Houthis being backed by the traditional Saudi rival, Iran. This is basically the same reason that Russia has been unable to destroy Ukraine's ability to wage war. The weapons factories are out west, even if the pace of deliveries is slower than Kyiv would like. To be clear, attacking Iran will not do anything like triggering a hypothetical equivalent to NATO's Article 5 collective defense provision, from Iran's perspective. But it opens up another can of worms that Washington might want to avoid. What that might look like would need a video of its own. But as a starting point, we can go to the other side of the Arabian Peninsula and the Strait of Hormuz. It is yet another choke point, this time of the Persian Gulf. Although there is no canal on this side, it is the other seaborne outlet for Saudi oil, never mind Iraqi oil, UAE oil, and Kuwaiti oil. Will the Red Sea warp zone turn into the Red Sea war zone? Let me know in the comments. If you want to know more about the war in Gaza, check out this playlist on the subject. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.